Hello friends, this is Seams and Finishes with Heather Rose Johnson. I want to start talking about your machine. The spool thread on top and the bobbin thread on the bottom, when they stitch, they come together and they hug one another and they create a lock stitch. Okay, I want to mention the feed dogs. They are located underneath the presser foot. The feed dogs are rough, jagged strips of metal, and they advance the fabric as you stitch. So if I release the presser foot, you can see them more clearly. The presser foot is released by a lever on the back side, which I will show you. If your machine does not have a lever to release the presser foot, you can loosen the screw in order to remove your presser foot. I want to point out the tension knob, which I will do a whole video on later, but your machine should be set anywhere between 4 and 5. But if you turn it to a larger number, there will be more tension, and if you turn it to a smaller number, there will be less tension. As your thread passes through the channel, there are two silver discs, like cymbals, pressing against one another, creating tension or drag on your thread. Okay, let's get to work. We're going to practice straight seams, curves, and corners. You need 6 pieces of fabric, it doesn't matter what size. Mine happen to be 5 inches by 8 inches, a light color woven fabric. You will also need a marker or a pen. You will need scissors. You will need a rotary cutter if you have it. You can do without. You need a ruler, preferably clear. Okay, stop the video, go get your supplies, and come back and meet me here. Okay, first step, take your pen or your marker and draw a straight line on your first set of pieces of fabric. Doesn't matter where, this is practice. On the next set, you're going to draw a right angle anywhere on the fabric. The whole point is that you have lots of room for your hands to manipulate the fabric as you sew. And on the third set, you're going to draw a curved line and just freehand it. If you want to trace the edge of a plate, go for it. Just draw a curved line. Okay, you're going to need a few more things. You're going to need a spool of thread, preferably a dark color, small scissors for snipping, a seam ripper, and your sewing shears. So stop this video and get your tools and meet me at your machine. Okay, now we're ready to sew. You will want to set your machine on a centered straight stitch. You will want a 2.5 stitch length, and you can ignore the zigzag. We don't need to worry about the stitch width. Locate your backstitch button on your machine. There it is. It may look different on every machine. Now let's talk about seam allowance. The most common seam allowance for home sewing is 5/8 of an inch. And here it is. Let me give you a close-up. This is the distance out from the needle to the right. You might be thinking, well, my machine doesn't have these markings. It doesn't have the lines on this metal throat plate. That's okay. Take a ruler and you can measure out from your needle to the right, and you can find your 5/8 of an inch, and you can put a piece of Scotch tape. Okay, my machine is threaded. The last step is for me to thread the eye of the needle and then pick up the bobbin thread. So I'm pulling the bobbin thread up to the surface, and I will then tuck the threads under my presser foot, and now we can sew. We're going to start with the first sample, the straight line. You will have 2 pieces of fabric, and we're looking at the side with the black line, and you're going to start here at the top, about 1/4 of an inch in from the raw edge. You're going to place your 2 pieces of fabric under your presser foot with the needle directly above the black line. The most important step, your presser foot must be down and the needle must be down inserted into your fabric before you start sewing. At the beginning and the end of every seam, you're going to backstitch. I like to push the foot pedal and count to 3, and then backstitch, or take it all the way back to the raw edge. The feed dogs will advance the fabric for you. Your job is to steer the fabric side to side, making little micro movements to stay on track. When you reach the end of your work, you're going to backstitch. And again,
I press the backstitch button, count 1, 2, 3, and then take it all the way to the raw edge.
You're going to lift the presser foot, pull your work out to the left, and trim your threads. Now we're going to move on to the next sample. This is your corner, your 90-degree corner. We're going to start the same way. You're going to pick either end. I'm going to pick this end and start 1/4 inch in from the raw edge. I'll place my fabric under my presser foot with the needle directly above my black line. And you're going to start the same way. Presser foot down, your needle down in the fabric. And you have to back stitch at the beginning. Count 1, 2, 3. And then you proceed. Continue stitching forward. And then once you reach the corner, you're going to stop, and you can manually turn your hand wheel so you have more control and you can go stitch by stitch. You want that needle to land right on top of that corner. I'm slowing down and I'm manually turning the hand wheel to control it. And you want to stop with the needle down in the fabric. That way you can lift the presser foot and you can turn the fabric wherever you need to. You can pivot on that corner and then put the presser foot down and continue. So you take it all the way to the end, and then before you reach the raw edge, you want to backstitch. We're going to move on to our final sample, and we're going to start the same way. You're going to pick an end and place it under your presser foot so that the needle is above the black line. And we're going to work our way around this curve. This is a little more challenging. Presser foot down, needle down, and you're going to backstitch at the beginning. And then one tip as you're stitching, focus on the black line as it passes right under the presser foot. So just watch right in front of the presser foot as you move the fabric along. And as you're stitching, it's okay to stop. Make sure your needle is down, and then you can lift the presser foot if you need to, and you can make these little pivots just like you did on the corner, but they're just smaller movements. And you just work your way around the curve. Don't feel like you have to do it in one motion. Oh, look at that. I made a mistake. I'm going to pull my work out and I'm going to get my seam ripper and I'm going to remove those few stitches that are not on top of the black line. Okay, now I'm going to put my work back under the needle and I'm just going to kind of pick up where I left off. So I want to back up enough so I can overlap my stitches, and since I'm starting over, I want to back stitch in order to lock my stitches in place. So just like before, when you reach the end, you have to back stitch and then take it all the way to the raw edge. Make sure your needle is up, lift your presser foot, pull your work out to the side, cut your threads, and your work is done. And of course, you want to go back and trim all of your loose threads. Okay, so do you remember when we talked about seam allowance? We're going to trim our samples so that you can see what 5/8 of an inch looks like. You're going to get your clear ruler, and the clear ruler is great because you can, got to trim those loose threads. Pet peeve of mine. Okay, get your ruler and you can read it, the length of the ruler or the width of the ruler, which I love. So the ruler is 2 inches wide, and we're going to find our 5/8 inch mark. There it is. So what we're going to do is lay the ruler down and mark 5/8 of an inch out to the right of our black line. Now, of course, in real life, if you were working on a project, you would not draw black lines on your work. But for demonstration purposes, I want to make sure you can see it. So I've written 5/8 SA, and SA means seam allowance. So you're going to cut off the extra fabric either with your rotary cutter or your sewing shears. And now you can see what 5/8 of an inch seam allowance looks like. Okay, we're going to do the same thing to our corner sample. And the whole point of having a larger piece was so that you have plenty of fabric to hold on to it and manipulate as you sew. And now we're going to cut it down so you can see what the seam allowance would truly look like if you were sewing from a commercial pattern, a pattern that you buy in the store. Typically, you're going to use a 5/8 seam allowance. Okay, so you're going to cut the extra fabric off. Okay, we're going to do the same thing to the curved seam. So we're going to use our clear ruler and we're going to mark 5/8 seam allowance along the outward curve, because when you're looking at it, you have an outward curve and an inside curve. So I want everyone to put their seam allowance along the outside curve. Okay, now we're going to talk about clipping. So this is a finishing technique, and we're going to look at the corner seam, and when you turn it right side out, you can see and feel that it's lumpy. And if you were to take this to the iron and press it, it's not going to look good. Look at the seam allowance, and we're going to clip the excess fabric. First, you're going to clip off the corner close to your stitching, but make sure you don't cut through your stitching. Then you're going to grade down each side and just kind of shave off a little bit more. Beautiful. Now, to protect the raw edge, we're going to use a product called Fray Check, and it is a clear glue that is used to seal the raw edge to keep it from fraying. So you just simply dab a little bit of the glue along the raw edge, and that will protect the raw edge. Okay, now you can turn your work right side out and you can see the difference. It's not lumpy anymore, and you can take your scissors and gently push the corner out, and you will have a beautiful finished corner. Okay, now we're going to talk about clipping along a curve. So we're looking at the outward curve, and if you turn the work right side out, again, you will feel it is lumpy, and if you try to press it with the iron, you're not going to get a nice smooth curve. So we need to clip the excess fabric. So turn it back, inside out, and we're going to clip little triangles within the seam allowance, about every inch or so around the curve. By doing this, you create space. When you turn your work right side out, the seam allowance is folding in onto itself, so you're creating space. And when you turn it right side out, you will have a nice smooth curve with no lumps. This is another example of where you could use your Fray Check. You could put little dabs of the glue at the tips of those triangles that you clipped. Okay, for demonstration purposes, I went ahead and I cut a 5/8 seam allowance along the inside curve. And I want to tell you, clipping the inside curve is a little different. You're simply going to cut slits into the seam allowance, again, like every inch or so around the curve. Because the opposite action is happening. When you turn your work right side out on the inward curve, the seam allowance needs to spread open. So you're releasing that tension and you're giving the seam allowance the room to spread open. I want to talk about another clipping technique called grading. This is used for a heavyweight, thicker fabric like a velvet or canvas. And what you would do is you would pick up one layer of your seam allowance and you're going to trim about half of the width off of that one layer. And this creates a stair-step effect, and it takes away some of the excess fabric and some of that bulk. The raw edge of the fabric will fray, so I want to show you a zigzag technique that will create a barrier and it will stop your fabric from fraying. Every zigzag has a width and a length. I'm using the auto set 3.5 and 1.4. I will show you what that looks like when you change those two settings. But we're going to zigzag within the seam allowance, and what it does, it just simply creates a barrier to slow down the fraying. So you can change the setting. If you want to change the width, this changes the zigzag as it jumps from left to right, side to side. So the larger the number, then the wider your zigzag will be. Okay, I'm going to change the width back. I'm going to go down to the auto set, 3.5. And I want to show you when you change the length. So that makes the zigzag longer, meaning that the zigzags are spaced further apart. Okay, so here's the finished product, and you can see where I've adjusted the width and the length. The auto set on my machine is appropriate for this technique. Now the zigzag is not my favorite technique, so I want to show you another technique with pinking shears. So these shears are scissors you can buy at a fabric store, and they are worth every penny. And you simply just trim this about half of the width of the seam allowance, and it creates a jagged edge which will slow down the fraying process. You will notice a lot of vintage clothing. On the inside, the seam allowance will be pinked with pinking shears. Hey friends, thanks for watching my video. I hope it was helpful, and I want everyone to take their samples and put them in their sewing skills portfolio. I'm going to show you mine. Here's my portfolio. Inside I have the samples from today's video, and I can go back, I can add notes, anything that's going to help remind me of these finishing techniques. Thank you for watching my video. Please subscribe to my channel and share with your friends. Leave comments, let me know what topics you want me to cover in future videos. And as always, learn to sew, love to sew.